This is Lou Elizondo, and you are listening to That UFO Podcast.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back to That UFO Podcast. My name is Andy, and I am joined today on the pod by a returning guest, author of multiple worldwide bestsellers, including Communion, based on his own terrifying experiences, also host of his own podcast, Dreamland, and speaker at this year's Contact in the Desert. I'd love to welcome back to the podcast, Mr. Whitley Strieber. Whitley, welcome back.
Thank you. I'm very glad to be back.
Listen, really good to have you on. Of course, you're a speaker at this year's Contact in the Desert, running May 30th till June 3rd. We are going to get to that, absolutely. But most recently, I want to kick off, Whitley, talking about your time attending the Sol Foundation conference back in November at Stanford. You had a ticket for that event. Can you talk about the whole experience and what was your overall thoughts on that sort of event?
Well, first, I think it was the most high-level UFO conference I've ever attended. In fact, it was the most high-level UFO conference anyone ever attended. There were a lot of major players in the field, and I don't mean the usual suspects like me and Linda Moulton Howe. I mean people like Gary Nolan and Diana Walsh-Pasulka, Jeffrey Kripal, Leslie Kane, and others along those lines, and some from even closer to the deeper levels of this exploration. And they gave a series of excellent talks, for the most part, surprising talks, especially I think Avi Loeb acquitted himself very well because he's been quite heavily criticized in the scientific community. And his explanations of why he believes as he does about what he's found were very coherent, surprising to me, because I didn't think much of this business of these little spherules that he's found, but he's quite certain that they aren't natural and his case is strong. There was one discussion about an underwater base off the coast of Santa Monica, not far from here. If the man is right about this base, it is about 4 miles from my house. So I guess I'm not wet, so I don't think I go there. But in any case, I was not. He's going to try to do an expedition looking for it. You know that there was a documentary by Carolyn Corey a couple of years ago about the number of lights that come up and out of the water, and you go into the water just off of Santa Catalina Island, which is where he wants to look. And if you look at a Google map of that area, you can see something underwater that doesn't look quite right. So it could be that we're going to either find an alien base or whoever goes down there isn't coming back, either one. But I thought that was a quite fascinating part of the discussion. The one thing I was rather disappointed in is that I was not asked to talk. And I asked Gary Nolan about this, whom I know quite well. We've been friends now for 10 years, probably. And he said that if we had had you on the schedule, quite a few of the people from the government and the defense industry would not have felt comfortable attending. And that has got to change. Because after all, if somebody is here, and all of these people seem to assume that's the case, very, very different from what you might read in the New York Times or the Guardian. There was recently an incredibly foolish article in the Guardian, in fact, a couple of days ago, parroting the arrow line that basically nothing to see here, which they could have pulled off in the 1960s. But now it's just a joke. And yet you see the press running along after them with their panting, and it's incredible. In any case, the idea that there might be UFOs flying around and someone like Lou Elizondo or David Grush can talk about that. Although Grush did imply in his congressional testimony that there were biologics as well. The idea that they can't talk about the close encounter witnesses and to them and have them participate is, I think, very disturbing. There's something there, fear, or a sense of a lack of control that everyone in this field has got to get used to. No, we're not in control. Someone has been abducting people and taking their sexual material for years, and no one can do anything about it. That doesn't sound like a controlled situation to me. And all of these people at that conference have got to face this. They're going to have another conference in Washington soon, and they once again will not face it. Until they do face it, basically, this goes nowhere of any real interest. The only place it can go of any real interest is toward the truth, which is what is our relationship with this other presence. Why are they here? And believe me, it has to do with the close encounter witnesses and abductees. That's where the answer lies.
You voiced that dissatisfaction or disappointment in an article in the debrief back at the time. And I wonder, how do you see that gap being bridged where experiencers are welcomed on that sort of billing in front of that sort of audience without a stigma, without a fear of being any sort of attack or reprisals?
Well, you ask a good question, and right now my immediate answer is I don't see it happening at all, ever. I absolutely do not see Christopher Mellon ever coming out and standing up on a podium and saying, and now I would like to introduce our next speaker, Whitley Strieber. I don't see it. What I do see is an asymmetric, well, I'll tell you precisely what I see. I see the planetary environment continuing to be stressed until it is so stressed that nobody on this earth can deny that the planet is changing in ways that are going to be very difficult for the human species to handle, not to mention many other species. When that happens, when we realize this is the Titanic and there aren't enough lifeboats and we can't go anywhere, that is when the visitors will show up, and they will show up very suddenly and it will be the most profound ontological shock mankind has ever known beyond anything else. And because these people were afraid to open this door early, that's how it's going to open. Bang, right in our faces. That will be the first time anyone will recognize the fact that the abductees have got a story to tell, but it'll be too late for anyone to hear that story.
Let me ask, just to try and comprehend that scenario a little more. If we have these visitors show up, and like you say, it's the same visitors who have been performing these, violations against people, which is what they are, do you foresee any other visitors potentially showing up at the same time who are maybe more friendly or sympathetic to the human cause? Or how do you foresee that playing out?
My experience of the visitors is that they are not that they are not sympathetic, but, well, I'll give you an example of how they are. I had sexual relationships with one of them in the mid-1980s, extensively. I'm not lying, and I'm not mistaken. I remember it in perfect detail. And I've written about it. It's in Supernatural. It's probably in other places too. I write so much. God knows what I've written. Anyway, then 11 years later, this bizarre child appeared in our woods behind our house, living rough in the woods. And at the time, I did not know what to make of this because he had certain capabilities. He could easily and fluently get into my mind and interact with me telepathically. And those interactions were very disturbing. Very disturbing. He was not right. There were things wrong with him. His affect was that of an extremely autistic individual and someone with a lot of schizophrenic affect as well. And I think they dropped him in the woods behind our house because he was partly me from that sexual relationship. And they just couldn't handle him because he hadn't worked out. And so they left him in my yard without so much as a by your leave. Now, this is what we're going to have to deal with. And I know everyone wants to believe, oh, there are Palladians, and this group and that group. And that's all folklore. That's just us talking to ourselves. The facts on the ground are that we have seen very little of those people, not that they don't exist, because I have had significant experience with them. But they're gone from here now. I haven't seen them in years, any of them, and I don't think anyone has. So what happened to them? I think we're going to have to deal with the grays. I think that's who's going to be here when push comes to shove. And we're going to be dealing with something that is not like us at all, that does not have the same kind of emotional experience that we do, not at all, and which sees us more as we might see sheep, not as a fox might see a rabbit, but as a farmer might see, or a shepherd might see his sheep that he cultivates over a season to get wool from, and then takes the wool and puts the sheep back out to pasture and cultivates another harvest of wool for the next year. And that's what's happening here. And I think this wool, in our case, is experience that we have gained in our lives. And quite frankly, I think if the situation becomes too overwhelming and the planet's environment breaks down in too many different ways, they're going to go to a second line of defense. And that's what all of these abductions and the taking of sperm and eggs were about. I think they've got another Earth somewhere that they're cultivating right now, frankly. I think there's a very strong possibility that they are going to leave us go when it becomes too difficult to maintain us. I'm not hearing you.
I'll mute myself this time, Whitley, when I read that, okay? I'm going to read a quote from your article, and this is based around that idea of study of these experiences, which links into what you said. And the quote was, "The truth is that we don't have any definite, incontrovertible evidence, either that the witnesses are describing what happened to them accurately, or that the entities they have encountered are involved with the unidentified flying objects that are ghosting around our world." And I wonder, is that part of that next step to try and bridge the gap between what is being reported and a more scientific study of experiencers?
Well, it has to be, because there can't be any motive to study the experiencers related to this unless there is some kind of relationship that we can point to. Now, and what I say in the article is that we don't have that in the public space, and we don't. I mean, I'm talking about, I may not say that, but I'm talking about the public space. We don't have any idea whether the UFOs are connected to what the beings that people see. We don't have a single video of any of the beings in contact with any people, and damn few videos that may or may not be authentic of any of them. And it's the most authentic ones are very equivocal. We don't have proof. So we don't know if the beings are connected to UFOs. We don't have proof that the beings are engaged with us. In other words, there's no proof, there's no video of an abduction or anything like that. So then where are we with this? And the answer is that we have to get to a point where we can take the study to what we do have, which is the witnesses. And there's lots that can be done there. The difficulty is that, and by that I mean functional MRI scanning to examine what is happening to in their brains when they talk about this and things like that. There's a lot that can be done. Sequential studies of their blood types and genetic makeup and so on and so forth, their brains and the way their brains are configured. There's lots of physical things that could be done that could probably get us to the point where we could identify the difference between someone who has definitely had one of these experiences and someone who is in an imaginary space. But that takes money. It takes a lot of money. And that gets you up against the granting system. And how are you going to get grants for this? The answer is, until there is some kind of clear connection admitted between the UFOs, the beings, and us, no grants are going to be involved at all. None. Now, back in, I guess it was 1988, I went to Dayton, Ohio on my communion tour. And Wright-Patterson Air Force Base was quite near where I was. I was in a bookstore quite near the base. Two young men came, not in uniform, but very neatly dressed. And they had a photograph with them. And this was before digital photography. This was a Kodak, and made with emulsion, in other words. So it wasn't a CGI effect or anything like that. They held it and showed it to me. It was I think, three of the little gray people standing under a tree in a neighborhood. And shining down from above, the top of the tree was just white light, like chalk white light. And the three beings were just standing there under the tree. And of course I said, could I have this? And one of them said, no, we just want to show it to you to let you know you're on the right track. And they left. Now that means somebody on the inside does know. And all of that granting is not being prevented by the fact that we don't have an evidentiary chain. It's that the evidentiary chain is hidden.
Mm-hmm.
That's the truth of it. And it has got to be one of the most spectacular and fundamental mistakes in history to hide that evidentiary chain, meaning that we can't find out what's going on. And I know enough about this and what's going on the inside that their understanding of the abduction phenomenon is incredibly primitive. It is not a major issue. The major issues are all weapons related and materials related and propulsion related, not people related. So they know it happens, but the truth of the matter is nobody cares on the inside. And of course, this is the one thing they should care about, because it's the one thing that ultimately really matters. To them, the visitors are a kind of abstraction. They're not real. They don't have contact. They're not like someone like me who lives with this. I mean, I live with it. I've lived with it all the time. And it's in my life in many different ways on a regular basis. So, but that doesn't happen to the people on the inside. There's been a few of them who have had close encounter experiences, most of them very frightening. And well, not surprising to me, they're always very frightening. The visitors are very frightening. And, but until there's some kind of link there, it's just not going to happen. We will not learn what we could. And the horror of it is all of the information we need is right there in the bodies and minds of the close encounter witnesses, waiting, ripe fruit, waiting to be picked, and no one will reach for it.
Can I ask, Whitley, are you aware of individuals, whether academic, military, scientists, whatever that may be, involved in the UFO topic, who are public facing, who are themselves experiencers or close encounter witnesses, who don't come forward and say that?
Well, Jim Semivan has come forward and said it. Robert Bigelow has come forward and said it. And yeah, there are a lot of people inside who haven't had, who don't come forward. And those are mostly people who have had extremely unusual and difficult experiences. And I know this because some of them have come to me, not as insiders, but I've gotten the feeling or even the certainty that that's where they were from when they were talking about their experience and trying and looking for help understanding it. And those experiences have not been pleasant. I mean, if you go out on a combat air patrol, what your officers and you encounter these things, and you paint them, target paint them, even if you don't fire, the odds are that these little beings are going to end up in your children's bedroom. That happens. So, and then afterwards, these people, of course, they go crazy. I had them in my son's bedroom, and I went crazy, believe me. I sat out in his door of his room. He was 7 years old with a big shotgun on my lap, and I slept during the day.
I wonder at this moment, Whitley, do you feel the door for the experiencer to come out and speak is more closed or more open than it's been before?
I think the rational way of looking at that is to look at each individual life. Because if you're in a marriage relationship that's in trouble and you're fighting for custody with your husband or wife, and the experiencer comes out in public, then I think the other spouse is highly likely to win that custody battle.
Yeah.
And the problem being that it may be that another example is, say someone is in a marriage relationship and they've got a couple of kids, and what they don't know is that their spouse is not happy. And they decide to go on a UFO program and talk about it, and they use their own personal names. Then 6 weeks later, divorce papers show up. What are they going to do? But it could be that there are other situations where the life is more stable. And if the life is more stable, then people will do a service to the world by coming out and being named.
Let me segue into listener questions, and I just want to mention, if anyone is hearing me speak to Whitley for the first time, Whitley did appear on the podcast last year. I'll put that link in the description. So if you're wondering a bit more about Whitley's backstory and you haven't heard that, then it was on the previous podcast, and I want to hand over to some listener questions because we never got to enough of them last time, Whitley. And the first one is from Stephen, and he asks, given the Sol Foundation's focus currently is not on experiencers, is there any possibility for the establishment of the academic study of direct contact experiences in another forum?
The difficulty is lack of funding. I know plenty of academics who would love to study this. The communion letters are available in an archive at Rice University, and there are mostly graduate students doing studies of it. But there's no big academic study and there's no money for digitization, and all kinds of problems with identifying, making sure that the letters are not identified with the witnesses who wrote them if they are digitized. So, but without that kind of level of funding, the access is limited. People, in order to study the letters, you've got to go down to Rice University and be confronted by these box after box of these letters that are just basically chronologically organized. And, that's not easy to work with. That's why it's mostly graduate students doing theses and papers. So again, without grant money, how is a scholar going to be supported doing this? And I know scholars who want to very much, and maybe they'll find a way.
Kat asks, how is Anne? How has her consciousness continued to evolve, and how do you two continue your communication with each other?
Remember that Anne said right after she passed, "I'm not Anne anymore, but I will always be Anne for you." That promise has not been broken, but it is not nearly the same as it was even a year ago. Something has faded between us. It used to be that I would be touched by her 3 or 4 times a day or more in a certain way, and specifically that a certain vibration would come down onto my lower legs, because it was clear that I must not under any circumstances touch back. And so it was always on a part of my body that I couldn't reach. And, and that would come if I was in a meeting and fell sleepy, then the vibrations would wake me up. In fact, once I was at a movie of a kind Anne really liked, and I did fall asleep. It was a child's movie, and they do put me to sleep. And the vibrations practically, I shot out of my chair, because she's obviously using my eyes in order to see it in this, and senses in order to see into this world. And she wanted to watch the movie. And all kinds of cool stuff happened like that, but not recently. In the past 3 or 4 months, it's gone. And I'm terribly miss it.
Do you feel it's gone for a reason?
It's gone for a lot of reasons. I am in a tremendously challenging situation right now on many different levels. And all of the energies that I had access to have withdrawn or been pushed away from me, so that I'm essentially naked in the middle of writing a book that will blow this whole thing up completely if I am able to finish it. And there are immense obstacles against me. Everything, including the loss of Anne, which is the worst one. Because, and the 3 a.m. meetings that I used to have that were so productive. I wrote Afterlife Revolution, A New World, Jesus, A New Vision, and them using those 3 a.m. interactions as inspiration and direction. And then a person came into my life during the creation of them, whose ability to help me in this was almost supernatural. And I counted on that individual to be here for the new book, which is the hardest book I've ever written. And they suddenly blew me off. Just blew me off. No, I wasn't even in a love affair with them. I was blown off as if I was a lover when I wasn't a lover. And I ended up without this help. I'm totally alone right now with this. Totally. And it's not wanted. One way I'm not alone is I'm being intimidated on all kinds of different levels at this time. It's very, very difficult. So no, I know I'm in free fall at the moment, with trying to keep my hands on the keys
Moving on to our next listener question from Tim. Tim asks, what are your thoughts on the best ways to support individuals who have endured prolonged trauma resulting from abduction, as well as ridicule after disclosure happens?
Well, since I am an individual who has had both of these things in their life, after disclosure happens, I am hoping the world will become more merciful and to see that these people, all of us, are literally the leading edge of humanity. We ended up out there alone in the dark when everybody else was safe home. And it's time for us to get a little loving instead of the ridicule. And what I fear most is that the people involved in the disclosure process within the government will think to themselves, well, we can't allow these people, these abductees, to have a voice because their voice might overpower ours. They might become a more important authority in this than we are. And so it might be that disclosure is accompanied by debunking of the abductees and a generalized effort on the part of the government to say, we're all a bunch of fantasists and it never happened to us. And what's worse is if disclosure involves interaction with the visitors openly, it's in their interest to say the same thing. And both sides will be lying. Don't forget this. Do not forget this.
Christian asks a couple of questions, Whitley. The first one being, do you think the UFO cover-up and the secrecy involved was enforced upon parts of the US government?
I think it might have been enforced by the visitors, but indirectly. I talk about that in my book, Them, a lot. They did things that we could not reveal to the public because they revealed our helplessness. And you couldn't reveal to the public, A, that they were real, and B, we couldn't do anything about it. And so the result was that nothing was revealed. And in that sense, yes, I think the visitors did orchestrate this to a degree because it's just not in their interest, especially that process started right back at the beginning before the abductions. And they probably already knew the abductions would take place and therefore that they had to have secrecy. Because what if everybody in the world knew that these beings just show up in their house at any time? We wouldn't be living the same way we do now. And it would be much harder for them to achieve their goals. As long as we were completely passive and sound asleep in the middle of the night with nothing protecting us like I was, they could march right in and do whatever they pleased. And so the secrecy was in their interest, and therefore I'm quite sure that however it worked, the government was influenced by them in the creation of its own secrecy.
Christian followed up by asking, do you think, hypothetically, if part of that deal was the secrecy, that is the reason they're scared to come forward and talk about the phenomenon now? For example, if the Air Force were part of that, do you think that's why they don't come out? Because breaking that secrecy, is bad for them.
Well, it has crossed my mind that this recent thing, this unbelievable childish whitewash that came out is the Arrow report saying nothing to see here, a completely obvious lie, even ignoring all of the video, officially released video, as if it was all wrong somehow. It was just absurd on the face of it. And I thought to myself, maybe there's a direct contact between them and the visitors. And I know the visitors well enough to know that they're going to be very rigid about something like that. They're not flexible. And they would say, no, you have to continue just as you were. And they might say to them, well, if we do that, we're going to look like idiots. And the response would be, continue just as you were. That would be one explanation for why it was so ridiculous and so transparent. Another possibility, and this is an interesting one, is that the visitors do want the secrecy to continue. And by creating a straw man like that, the government is sort of under their thumb. And by creating a straw man like that, it's saying to the world, you better look a little deeper because we can't. So those are two possibilities.
Peter asks, is there any evidence of any kind of technological device that can detect or deter abductions? For example, a siren, strobe, or electromagnetic pulse triggered when conditions are met, suggesting the visitor's presence?
Well, I think there is. And I think we've had it a long time, and I'll tell you why. Back when before I published Communion, I got contacted by David W. Webb. David Webb was a major player in the inside. He was in space sciences, and if you look at his CV on Wikipedia, you'll see that he was consulting with every alphabet agency in the world. I mean, in the U.S. government. And he came out to the cabin. He had dinner with us in the city. We became friends. He introduced me to an allergist who helped me with the allergic responses I was getting when the visitors came close to me. He knew all about this in 1987, all about it. And we would always know that the visitors had been there during that period because this strange little airplane would very high up, and you'd look at it, it would be white against the sky, and its wings were so narrow that it looked like it was going to fall out of the sky. I had a physicist there once, and I was telling him about the plane, and I was saying if the visitors show up, then that plane shows up the next afternoon, almost always. And he said, well, didn't you just say they showed up last night? I said, yeah, I did. In a little while, sure enough, the plane came. And you could hear it. It was a prop plane with very strange long engine nacelles, and you could hear it up there. And I said, let's go out and see if we can see it. And we went out, and he looks up and he sees it, and he went like this because the wings were so narrow, it looked like it would fall out of the sky. I said, don't worry, it's got very strange wings. It never falls out of the sky. But they knew, and they knew much more. Someone did. But then you get into the layering of this secrecy, and there are layers of it. I know people on the inside who think they know everything that's going on, but I know for certain that they don't. So it's very complex, and someone knows about the abductions. I don't know if that knowledge is all that general within the defense industry and the Defense Department.
Do you think there's any way to preempt an abduction and know that it's going to happen before?
I don't think there's any way we know of to know it's going to happen. But I think if it'd be terribly easy to preempt them. The motion sensitive lights, guns, alarm systems, all kinds of things like that would work if we only knew what to expect. That's a big reason for the secrecy. So we won't be trying to preempt them. I'm sure we could, because then the bottom line is this is a physical experience. An abduction is a physical experience. It's not an out-of-body experience. It's an in-the-body experience. Believe you me.
A question from Ultra. You may appreciate this as an author who's had many of his works turned into movies and TV series. Over the years, are there any references similar to your experience that you have seen pop up in TV series and movies, etc., that you feel have been good depictions?
Not really good depictions, but yeah, there's obviously it's a big meme. Even the Communion movie doesn't depict it very adequately. I will say the Communion movie captures some of the emotional intensity of the post-abduction experience. But for the most part, these are made by people who haven't been abducted, because so far as I know, No great director has ever had the abduction experience. If one did, and I do know a couple who may have, and decided to make a movie about it, might be a different story.
Do you think that's something you could pick up very easily? If, say, a director made a movie and you didn't know they'd had an experience, do you think just from how they portray the experience, you would know that they were themselves a contactee?
I would be, if the movie had a certain tone to it, I would suspect strongly that maybe they were an abductee. Yeah, but I wouldn't necessarily be sure of anything.
No, that's fair. A question from Jag. Jag asks, with David Grush hinting at the phenomenon being interdimensional rather than extraterrestrial, what are your thoughts on this as an experiencer?
The word interdimensional has no meaning. I don't know what it means. It just means that's something it's something we don't understand. We have to remember something very fundamental about human knowledge. The most fundamental reality of human knowledge is we do not understand quantum gravity. We do not understand quantum gravity. Because we do not understand quantum gravity, questions like that cannot be answered rationally. Because we lack an understanding of the most fundamental reality in the universe. Our physics is all a house of cards because we don't have that basic understanding. And that's the only way, and it's a little indirect, that I can think of to answer that question truthfully, and if you think about it, clearly.
There's a follow-up from Pete, and I'm going to ask you, given you just mentioned interdimensional not really meaning anything, bear with me here. So if the visitors are quote-unquote interdimensional or from that other place or not from our physical world, do you think the Greys could be avatars to bridge some kind of dimensional gap?
That's a very interesting question, because if you read my book, A New World, you'll find that I was involved in such an activity. And it started at the Lokata Sioux Reservation in South Dakota, and where over a 3-day period, every time I closed my eyes, I saw a different world. Clearly. Not like a dream, but clearly, to the point that with my eyes closed, I could reach down and on the roadside and see the tiny plants on the roadside, and then open my eyes, and it would be a different roadside and different tiny plants. At one point, I could close my eyes and see the moon in a different part of the sky than it was in this universe, slightly different, not completely. Then I came back to Santa Monica. And one morning, I was getting out of bed, and suddenly I was riding a bicycle down a street nearby, Montana Avenue, toward the ocean. And Montana tees into the ocean, into Ocean Avenue, and then there's a bluff, and then the Pacific. And I was literally riding this bicycle, and I was fooling with the gears because it was not a familiar bicycle to me. And it was instantaneous. I went from bedside to riding the bicycle in an instant. And I had a cell phone in my pocket. And as I approached the T, there's streetlights at the T. And they have the regular round red, green things that we have here, that we have in our... That's what we have in our reality, excuse me. But these streetlights were different. They had arrows, green and red arrows. Either there was a green arrow or a red arrow, meaning that you could, if the arrow was green, you could safely turn in the direction of that T, and red, you had to wait. And I was absolutely astonished. And I called a friend on the cell phone, which I already knew was in my pocket, and I presume he had the same number in the other reality as he does in this one. And I started describing all of this stuff to him, and he said, "Well, you're not telling me anything. I don't know." And then a few minutes later, it ended. What in the world was that? Was I in another version of this reality or not? I don't know. but I can see it very often. If I go down there right now in the sun and sit in the sun in a certain place and close my eyes, the other reality will become apparent. And in my book, in A New World, I discovered a theory called the mirror universe theory, which may explain this. And incidentally, I got a chance to see details of climatic differences and geographic differences and so forth when I was at the Lakota Sioux Reservation. And when I would close my eyes, they have a Bureau of Indian Affairs has built a highway down the center of the reservation. And it's a very nice highway. I mean, it's not marvelous, but it's, a nice 2-lane blacktop. When I closed my eyes, I wasn't on a 2-lane blacktop anymore. It was a wagon track, and we were driving along in a big car. And when I closed my eyes, I could see a wagon track, and when the wagon track followed the curvature of the ground, and the car followed the Bureau of Indian Affairs highway, it was like the car had started flying and I would lose my stomach. It was that vivid. And I could see what were little rills in our world were big streams, and it was all very, very dark. There was, it was not night, but it was like a colder climate, cloudy, and obviously quite a bit colder than this climate. In other words, I was there at a time when the ice age in that world hadn't ended. It didn't have an end to its ice age. There's a book by a lady named another Native American called Barbara Hand Clow called Catastrophophobia, that the theory of it being that there was a terrible catastrophe here about 12,000 years ago, which there certainly was. We know that from the geologic record, but that mankind is living in amnesia because of the trauma that was involved in this catastrophe. And we were down to, at one point, just a few thousand individuals left alive on Earth. I mean, we nearly went extinct. And that trauma is still with us. But not in the other universe. In the mirror universe, it's a much quieter, more sedate, less populated, and more colder world, different world. But I think it exists. So, but when you say interdimensional, what in the world does that mean? As far as building a sort of portal between them, well, I have to tell you, they didn't want me there. So why would anyone from there be building a portal? Unless, of course, there are many of them. The many worlds theory is true. If the many worlds theory is true, then there's somebody somewhere who's desperate to escape their dimension, for sure. And that would be who we're seeing.
I've got a question for you from Newman, and there's a little bit of background to it, so bear with me. And he quotes your friend Linda Moulton Howe here. He mentions that on Linda's Earth Files podcast, she says, if the final ingredient of it all, that the whole of our existence is taking place like a huge theatrical production, it is for the education and evolution of the soul. So Newman asks, in this spirit, what is Whitley's experience and opinion on the connection between the phenomenon and a potential reality beyond, which you've sort of mentioned, and I'm going to add to that. He says, are the non-human intelligences particularly interested and motivated in their actions and behaviors, for example, abductions, by the qualities of our consciousness and soul?
In my case, they were motivated by my intelligence and also by my family's prior connection to this. My uncle was involved in the gathering of the materials, the analysis of the materials, rather, at Wright Field after the Roswell incident, and probably the bodies too, but he never talked about that. And this thing follows paths, and I guess I fulfilled the criteria: intelligent enough, a capable communicator, and unwilling to quit I will quit. I'll die. That's when I'll quit. I have no intention of quitting before that then. And I have just a hell. I'm going through literally living hell right now because I'm writing a book that is absolutely not wanted by the visitors, by the government, by any of them. And it's going to demystify the visitors. And they don't want that at all. That's what the secrecy is all about. And they have done everything to me except kill me, because so far that doesn't appear to be on the table. But I've taken steps that if that is on the table, someone will publish the book anyway, or the part of it that's finished when it happens.
A question from Shelley, and she starts off by sharing her own experience, Whitley. She mentioned that previously she was speaking to someone about an experience of her own, and they mentioned that you had said you were woken up in the middle of the night by something touching your nose. She says she was woken up in the middle of the night. Something touched her nose. She sat up straight up. It grabbed her nose. Her nose was ice cold, but what she saw froze her in shock. She had fell asleep on the couch with the light still on, so she could see clearly two rubbery or wavy like yellowish banana colour, like the blackest looking veins in their arms. They started retracting back towards the wall, like it was she said she was startled, and when she sat up really fast they retracted back into the walls and disappeared. Had you ever had anything like that you've heard of or seen?
Yeah, I have had many experiences like that. That's my life, or had been until it stopped recently. I guess is another way of making it harder for me to finish this book. I was kissed, touched in all kinds of ways for years. You know, I've got to go, and I'm going to end. This is a perfect place to end this with I write poetry, and I'm going to have a book of poetry called A Hidden Garden, published soon. And I'm going to read a poem that is directly germane to this listener's question or comment about being touched. And remember, this is not all bad. This is just hard. There's a difference between hard and bad. This poem is called Somebody Kissed Me. And this is what it's like to live like this. Deep last night, somebody kissed me. I'm an old man and I live alone, but somebody kissed me. I'm not very pretty and was never very pretty, but they kissed me long. I wondered at their breath, soft, cool, and sweet as death. There's nobody here but me, there never is, but somebody kissed me. They kissed me long. The breath so soft, the lips so warm. I reached up into the air and found nobody there. But still they kissed me and kissed me long. An owl murmured, and the leaves rustled, the curtains blew. The night left me behind, and the kiss did too. I threw back the sheet and wondered what to do. I don't belong to the sunlight and the day. I am an old man and belong to the night. And that kiss, I belong to that kiss too. So this is my life, my friend.
This year, Whitley, you are speaking on multiple panels at Contact in the Desert. And like I said at the start of the show, that runs from May 30th until June 3rd. And that is at the Renaissance Emerald Resort and Spa, Indian Wells in Indian Wells, California. You can get tickets at contactinthedesert.com. Do you want to speak a little bit, Whitley, about your appearances this year and what people can expect?
Yeah, well, I'm gonna talk about my book, Them, and go a little bit beyond it, because I am deep in a new book, which is going to be the most revolutionary book I've ever written and the most revolutionary book on this subject ever written, assuming I live long enough, because there's a whole lot of different players who don't want a book like that written for a lot of different reasons, not the least of which goes back to these hybrids we brushed past earlier. They don't want the book written. The last time I was writing Them, they didn't want it written, and it got so bad around here. It was bad that I left, and fortunately for me, a lovely family in England took me in, and I wrote the book at their kitchen table. But this time, this monstrous thing was prepared and mysteriously to me destroyed my relationship with this family just before right in the middle of my starting to write the book. Now I don't have them to fall back on. And I'm here in this place where, let me see here if this is on, just a second. This is at a signal 144.1 megahertz. If you buy a radio like this and turn it on, you won't find a signal there because it's a clear channel. You may in the UK. I don't know if it's clear in the UK or not, but in the US, it's a clear channel. Not in this flat. In this flat, there's always a signal there. But if you take this radio out, if you just take it out onto the deck, the signal disappears because the signal doesn't propagate. It's not a normal radio signal, in other words. And I'm in here living in this all the time. And I have no place to go. And I have to write a book they hate. So that's where I am. And I'll be talking about that too, believe me.
And as well as that, you're going to be speaking with colleagues on the Legends panel. You're with, hosted by Paul Hynek. You've got Russell Targ, Travis Walton, George Noory, Linda Moulton Howe, and Richard Dolan. You're also on the Experiencers panel as well during that time too. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I honestly, I go on so many of these things. I'm not absolutely sure what panels I'm on, but I know it'll be a great event. And when you do if you come to me, you will find yourself directly engaged with a real experiencer. I'm the real deal, period. And second, I'm very approachable. I don't hide. And I'm going to be giving all kinds of fabulous information, in my opinion, because I know one thing: there's nobody else has ever done what I'm doing in this world. And I won't be doing it forever, so come. That is all for this week's show. Thank you very much for listening. Please remember to leave the podcast a review on your chosen platform. You can like, retweet, and subscribe. That would all be very much appreciated. The shows are being uploaded onto YouTube as we speak more and more. You can sign up at patreon.com/That UFO podcast to access the shows ad-free as well. Please get in touch on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, That UFO podcast. Of course, on Twitter, it's at UFO UAPAM. And again, folks, as always, keep looking up. You never know what you might see.
It wasn't a tic-tac and not quite a saucer, more like a hubcap designed by Chaucer, a little Baroque and quite steampunk, like Alice was playing bass for the Parliament of Folk. The little fucker hovered right outside of my window, and when I shoved out the screen, he made it an issue. I don't think he expected me to see his ass, but I'd had some champagne and smoked a little.